The studio suddenly went quiet as a calm discussion unexpectedly turned tense during the live broadcast. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, leaving both the audience and panelists momentarily unsure how to respond? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began as a typical morning show discussion, with the panel exploring recent trends in comedy and entertainment. Adam Sandler was in the studio to promote his latest project, and the tone was meant to be light, conversational, and informative. The cameras panned across the panel, capturing smiles and casual exchanges as Whoopi Goldberg introduced the topic, highlighting Sandler's long-standing career and his impact on comedy over the past 3 decades. Initially, the conversation flowed as expected, with Sandler sharing anecdotes from his past roles and discussing his process for creating relatable humor. As the conversation developed, Goldberg shifted the focus slightly, commenting on how some modern comedy can be polarizing, referencing moments in Sandler's career that had received criticism for content or style. Her tone was measured, consistent with her typical on-air persona, but the phrasing was pointed. She asked Sandler if he had ever felt constrained by public perception or worried that his comedic style might be misinterpreted by certain audiences. While the question was framed as curiosity rather than accusation, there was a noticeable pause among the panelists and the studio audience, signaling that the question touched on a sensitive area. Sandler responded initially with humor, deflecting slightly by recounting a few behind-the-scenes stories about his films. He mentioned that comedy, by nature, is subjective, and that what resonates with one audience might not resonate with another. His body language was relaxed at first, leaning back slightly, hands resting on the table. But as the discussion continued, a subtle shift became apparent. He leaned forward, making direct eye contact with Goldberg, signaling that he wanted to address the concern seriously rather than gloss over it. The dynamic between the two began to change as the conversation deepened. Goldberg reiterated her point, emphasizing the broader societal context in which comedy operates today, particularly the increased attention to cultural sensitivity and social commentary. She noted that some jokes that were once considered harmless might now be seen differently, and she asked Sandler if he felt responsible for the potential impact of his humor. There was a slight edge to her tone, not confrontational, but deliberate, as if to invite reflection. The other panelists, sensing a more serious discussion emerging, shifted in their chairs and leaned in, ready to moderate or interject if needed. Sandler paused before responding this time, choosing his words carefully. He acknowledged the changing cultural landscape, but expressed that his intent was never to offend or harm. He explained that comedy, in his view, was about connecting with people, telling stories that reflect shared human experiences, and sometimes pushing boundaries in a way that prompts thought or laughter. He emphasized that he appreciated the feedback from audiences and critics alike, but he maintained that the intent behind the joke mattered as much as the reception. As the dialogue unfolded, the studio atmosphere became perceptibly tense, though still professional. The audience remained attentive, some nodding in agreement, others leaning forward with curiosity. Sandler's voice remained calm but firm, and his gestures were measured, conveying that he was fully engaged in the exchange and wanted to clarify his perspective. Goldberg listened carefully, occasionally nodding, but she maintained a steady gaze, signaling that she intended to hold space for her point of view. The moment that most viewers would later cite as pivotal came when Goldberg pressed further, asking if Sandler thought comedians should adapt their material in response to evolving social norms. Sandler responded with a nuanced perspective, noting that while he respected social change, creativity cannot exist in a vacuum. He argued that comedy must balance awareness with authenticity, and that self-censorship could sometimes dilute the connection with audiences. His tone was deliberate, slightly firmer than earlier in the segment, reflecting a desire to assert his professional philosophy without escalating tension unnecessarily. By this point, the other co-hosts began to contribute, offering perspectives that ranged from supportive to mildly critical. Sunny Hostin and Joy Behar interjected with clarifying questions, creating a rhythm in which the conversation moved between reflection, challenge, and explanation. The pacing of the segment slowed slightly, with longer pauses between statements, highlighting the seriousness of the exchange. The studio audience remained engaged, reacting subtly with polite applause or quiet murmurs of acknowledgement after key points were made. The first part of this discussion set the stage for a deeper exploration of the balance between humor and social responsibility. Both Sandler and Goldberg demonstrated professionalism and restraint, even as the conversation navigated areas of disagreement. The segment reflected the complexity of live television discussions, where casual exchanges can evolve into thoughtful and occasionally tense dialogue about career, intent, and cultural context. This initial exchange framed the tone for the remainder of the segment, leaving viewers with a clear sense that what might have begun as a light promotional appearance had turned into an important discussion about comedy, perception, and the responsibilities of artists in a changing society. As the segment moved forward, the conversation naturally began to explore specific examples from Adam Sandler's career, illustrating the points he and Whoopi Goldberg had been discussing. Sandler referenced several of his earlier films and sketches, acknowledging that some had received criticism while others were widely embraced. He described his approach to crafting jokes and characters, emphasizing the thought process behind his work rather than any desire to provoke controversy. The explanation was detailed, with Sandler breaking down how humor is often layered and contextual, dependent on timing, delivery, and audience expectations. His tone remained calm, measured, and explanatory, giving viewers insight into the creative decisions behind the laughter that audiences often take at face value. Goldberg responded by citing a few examples that had sparked conversation in the media, noting that some viewers had felt certain jokes might cross the line or reinforce stereotypes. Her delivery was steady, highlighting her concern without being accusatory. She clarified that she did not intend to criticize Sandler personally, but rather to examine the role comedians play in reflecting societal attitudes. This framing was crucial. It kept the conversation in the realm of professional discussion rather than turning it into a personal conflict. The other co-hosts listened attentively, offering nods or subtle affirmations that reinforced the seriousness of the dialogue. At this point, the exchange began to show the hallmarks of a classic live talk show discussion: overlapping perspectives, careful interruptions, and the give and take that keeps viewers engaged. Joy Behar, sensing that the conversation might become repetitive if it stayed too narrowly focused, asked Sandler how he decides what material is appropriate for different audiences. Sandler's response was thoughtful. He explained that context matters enormously, whether he is performing for a family audience, a streaming platform, or a live show, and that he considers the potential impact of his material while striving to remain authentic. He emphasized the importance of intent, making clear that his goal is always to entertain rather than offend. Sunny Hostin added a legal and social perspective, suggesting that comedy exists in a space influenced by public opinion, media reaction, and evolving cultural norms. She asked whether Sandler feels that there is pressure to adapt his style to fit current sensitivities. Sandler acknowledged that societal expectations have shifted over time and that comedians naturally evolve in response. He stressed, however, that adaptation is different from compromising one's creative integrity. His explanation was delivered in a calm, articulate manner, reinforcing that this was a professional reflection rather than a defensive argument. Throughout this portion of the discussion, body language and pacing played a subtle but important role. Sandler leaned forward slightly when explaining his thought process, using hand gestures sparingly to emphasize key points. Goldberg maintained a steady posture, occasionally gesturing with her hands to underscore questions or clarifications. The audience's attention was palpable. There were small, appreciative murmurs and nods as each participant articulated their perspective. The co-hosts' interjections acted as a balancing force, ensuring that the conversation remained respectful and did not veer into personal confrontation. As the dialogue continued, the conversation also began to touch on the broader implications of comedy in society. Goldberg asked whether comedians have a responsibility to address sensitive topics or whether their role is primarily to entertain. Sandler responded that while some comedians choose to tackle social issues head-on, his approach has always been rooted in storytelling and relatable humor. He reiterated that comedy can open dialogue indirectly by reflecting human experiences, even when the subject matter is lighthearted. This perspective prompted thoughtful nods from the panel, and the audience reacted with a quiet, contemplative murmur that underscored their engagement with the topic. The conversation took a slightly more reflective turn when Goldberg asked Sandler about feedback from fans and critics over the years. Sandler acknowledged that reactions vary widely and that not every joke will resonate with every audience. He emphasized the importance of listening without overcorrecting, explaining that understanding reception is valuable, but creativity cannot be entirely dictated by public opinion. His explanation was measured and professional, showing an awareness of both artistic integrity and social awareness. At several points, the co-hosts clarified or reframed questions, ensuring that the exchange remained focused and understandable for viewers at home. These interjections were subtle, but they helped maintain the flow and prevented the discussion from becoming circular. The tone of the segment remained serious but grounded, capturing the balance between candid reflection and daytime television decorum. By the end of this portion, viewers could sense a mutual respect between Sandler and Goldberg. While the discussion was candid and occasionally tense, it remained rooted in professional insight and personal perspective. The dialogue highlighted the complexities of comedy, the challenges of evolving social expectations, and the ways in which live talk shows navigate potentially sensitive topics while remaining informative and engaging. The segment at this stage had firmly established itself as more than a promotional interview. It had become a thoughtful exploration of creativity, public perception, and the evolving responsibilities of artists. Audience engagement, both in studio and on social media, would later reflect appreciation for the nuanced, grounded conversation, setting the stage for the more detailed exchanges that would follow in the next part of the discussion. As the conversation progressed into its third segment, the exchange between Adam Sandler and Whoopi Goldberg moved into more specific territory, exploring how individual moments in a comedian's career can shape public perception. Goldberg brought up certain sketches and films that had previously sparked media commentary, asking Sandler to reflect on how he processes both criticism and praise. She framed her question in a professional, even-handed way, emphasizing the importance of understanding how comedy interacts with social context rather than as a personal critique. The tone in the studio remained calm but attentive, with co-hosts and audience members leaning in as they sensed the discussion was moving into deeper, more analytical ground. Sandler responded by explaining that every performer faces varying reactions, and that he has learned to navigate feedback without letting it dictate his creative decisions entirely. He noted that while some jokes may not land or may provoke unintended reactions, the intent behind the work and the overall connection with the audience remain paramount. His voice was steady, measured, and clear, reflecting both thoughtfulness and a commitment to maintain a respectful tone. At the same time, his expressions and subtle gestures communicated engagement, signaling to both the panel and the viewers that he was taking the discussion seriously. Goldberg pressed further, asking whether Sandler felt a responsibility to modify his material to fit shifting cultural standards. This question touched on a delicate balance between creative freedom and social awareness. Sandler acknowledged that context does matter and that comedians inevitably evolve alongside societal expectations, but he made it clear that adaptation does not mean compromising authenticity. He emphasized that humor, by nature, challenges assumptions, highlights absurdities, and sometimes pushes boundaries, but the foundation should always be rooted in genuine human experience rather than provocation for its own sake. The co-hosts interjected occasionally to ensure clarity for the audience at home. Joy Behar noted that viewers often see only the finished product and may not understand the thought process behind creating comedy. She asked Sandler to elaborate on how he decides what content is appropriate for a given audience. Sandler explained that it involves careful consideration of tone, context, and timing. He gave examples from his recent projects, describing how scripts are refined through collaboration, rehearsal, and sensitivity to audience reaction. His explanation conveyed that professionalism, preparation, and intention are central to his process, balancing both humor and awareness without sacrificing creativity. Throughout this segment, the subtle dynamics between Sandler and Goldberg were evident. Goldberg maintained a composed demeanor, listening attentively and framing questions with measured phrasing that invited reflection rather than confrontation. Sandler, in turn, responded with clarity and patience, occasionally using pauses to consider his response carefully before speaking. The studio audience mirrored this tone, attentive but restrained, acknowledging key points with quiet murmurs and occasional polite applause. This calm yet engaged atmosphere reinforced the professional tenor of the discussion. The conversation began to explore a broader question about the role of comedians in society. Goldberg asked whether humor should be primarily about entertainment, social commentary, or a combination of both. Sandler offered a nuanced perspective, noting that comedy has always served multiple functions, providing laughter, prompting thought, and sometimes fostering dialogue. He described how certain jokes or storylines can reflect shared experiences in a way that is both entertaining and insightful, without necessarily carrying a direct moral or lesson. This perspective drew subtle affirmations from the co-hosts, who emphasized that Sandler's approach demonstrated an awareness of both artistic responsibility and the power of audience engagement. Sandler also addressed the challenge of creating content that resonates across diverse audiences. He acknowledged that not every joke or scenario will appeal to everyone, and that subjective interpretation is inevitable. His reflections conveyed an understanding of both the professional and human elements of performance, recognizing the unpredictable nature of audience reaction while asserting the importance of maintaining creative integrity. Goldberg responded by highlighting that this awareness of audience response is crucial, particularly in an era of heightened social discourse and rapid media feedback. The panel's dynamic continued to support a thoughtful dialogue. Sunny Hostin offered a perspective on public accountability, noting that celebrities and comedians are often held to high standards precisely because their work reaches millions. Sandler agreed that public visibility carries certain responsibilities, but he reiterated that intention, context, and authenticity remain guiding principles in his creative process. The exchange remained calm yet substantive, demonstrating how live talk shows can navigate potentially tense topics while keeping the conversation grounded in reality. By the end of this third segment, the discussion had moved from general commentary on comedy and perception to specific reflections on Sandler's career, creative choices, and the evolving expectations of audiences. Both Sandler and Goldberg maintained professionalism, creating a measured and thoughtful tone that allowed viewers to follow the complexity of the exchange without sensationalism. The audience remained attentive, and the panel's facilitation ensured that the dialogue remained engaging and informative, setting the stage for a deeper exploration of moments of tension and clarification that would emerge in the next part of the segment. As the discussion entered its fourth segment, the conversation began to take on a more introspective tone, moving beyond generalities into specific instances where Sandler's work intersected with public criticism. Goldberg asked him to reflect on moments when audience reaction had surprised him, either positively or negatively, and how he processed that feedback. Her approach was methodical and professional, encouraging Sandler to explain his perspective without turning the conversation into confrontation. The audience in the studio remained quiet but attentive, sensing that this portion of the dialogue would reveal a more personal dimension of his creative process. Sandler acknowledged that there have been times when certain jokes or characters elicited unexpected responses. He explained that, as a performer, he pays attention to how material lands, but he also recognizes that reception is subjective and influenced by cultural context, personal experience, and timing. He emphasized that reflection is part of the process, noting that constructive feedback can be valuable in refining performance and storytelling. His delivery was calm and deliberate, with measured gestures that conveyed thoughtfulness rather than defensiveness. Goldberg followed up by asking how he balances staying true to his comedic voice while remaining aware of evolving societal expectations. This question struck at the heart of the tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility. Sandler responded by explaining that balance is achieved through continuous observation, collaboration with writers and directors, and careful consideration of audience dynamics. He stated that while adaptation is sometimes necessary, it must not compromise the core authenticity of the material. This distinction became a key point in the conversation, framing Sandler's approach as professional and conscientious rather than dismissive of criticism. At this stage, co-hosts played a crucial role in moderating and expanding the discussion. Joy Behar remarked that audience perception often conflates intent with impact, highlighting that viewers sometimes respond emotionally without considering the underlying context of a joke. Sandler agreed, adding that comedy is a dialogue between performer and audience, where both sides interpret content through their own lenses. Sunny Hostin contributed a legal and social dimension, suggesting that while intent matters, public figures inevitably operate under scrutiny, and that accountability is a part of visibility in entertainment. The segment reached a subtle turning point when Goldberg asked a question about responsibility, whether comedians should consider the broader societal implications of their work or if the primary obligation is simply to entertain. Sandler responded with nuance, acknowledging that while his main objective is to entertain and connect with audiences, he also recognizes that humor can influence perspectives and contribute to cultural dialogue. He framed his approach as thoughtful and intentional, emphasizing that he aims to create comedy that is relatable, inclusive, and mindful of diverse audiences without sacrificing the essence of his voice. Throughout the exchange, the live studio environment added layers of subtle tension and engagement. Sandler maintained steady eye contact and a composed posture, signaling confidence and sincerity. Goldberg, in turn, remained poised, occasionally gesturing with her hands to reinforce points without escalating the intensity. The audience reacted with measured applause at key insights, reflecting both appreciation and curiosity. These nonverbal cues highlighted the professionalism and mutual respect that kept the dialogue constructive despite underlying disagreements. As the conversation continued, specific examples from Sandler's recent projects were introduced to illustrate his approach to balancing humor and awareness. He discussed the process of evaluating scripts, testing material, and refining performances to ensure that jokes land effectively while remaining conscious of potential sensitivities. Goldberg acknowledged these points, noting that her interest was not in challenging his talent, but in exploring how performers navigate the evolving landscape of social expectations. The co-hosts contributed additional context, emphasizing that these discussions reflect broader questions in entertainment about accountability, creativity, and public perception. The dynamic between Sandler and Goldberg remained professional, but a noticeable level of tension persisted in the pauses between statements. Both parties carefully considered their words before speaking, which contributed to the serious but grounded tone of the segment. The pacing of dialogue alternated between thoughtful explanations and probing questions, creating a rhythm that allowed the audience to absorb complex ideas without feeling overwhelmed. By the end of this fourth segment, the conversation had evolved into a substantive discussion about the intersection of creativity, responsibility, and audience perception. Viewers were presented with a clear understanding of Sandler's perspective on humor, societal awareness, and the delicate balance between artistic expression and public accountability. The segment had moved steadily from introductory commentary into nuanced reflection, laying the groundwork for the concluding portion, where the exchange would be wrapped up and reactions both in studio and online would be addressed. As the segment approached its conclusion, the conversation began to wind down, with both Adam Sandler and Whoopi Goldberg taking time to summarize their perspectives. Goldberg acknowledged Sandler's thoughtful responses and emphasized that her questions were intended to explore the broader responsibilities of comedians rather than critique him personally. Sandler responded with appreciation for the opportunity to explain his process and philosophy, reiterating that his primary goal has always been to entertain while remaining mindful of audience impact. The tone in the studio was calm and reflective, signaling to viewers that the discussion had reached a natural resolution. The co-hosts contributed closing remarks, framing the exchange as an example of how live talk shows can handle sensitive topics thoughtfully. Joy Behar noted that conversations about comedy and social responsibility are increasingly relevant in today's media landscape, highlighting the importance of context and intent. Sunny Hostin added that Sandler's perspective underscored the complexity of balancing creative freedom with audience expectations. These final reflections reinforced that the discussion had been professional, grounded, and insightful, providing viewers with a nuanced understanding of both Sandler's work and the broader considerations involved in contemporary comedy. The studio audience responded with polite applause, a mix of acknowledgement and appreciation for the candid yet respectful dialogue. There were no dramatic reactions or disruptions. Rather, the response was consistent with the tone of the discussion, attentive, reflective, and engaged. Viewers could sense that the segment had achieved its purpose, offering insight into Sandler's career, addressing potential criticism with clarity, and demonstrating how live television can facilitate substantive dialogue without escalating into conflict. Following the episode, social media reactions reflected a range of perspectives, with many viewers praising Sandler for his thoughtfulness and professionalism, while others engaged in broader conversation about comedy, cultural sensitivity, and the evolving role of entertainers. Clips from the segment circulated online, highlighting key moments of reflection and exchange between Sandler and Goldberg. Commentators noted that the segment stood out for maintaining a calm, rational tone rather than resorting to sensationalism or heated confrontation, which is often the norm in discussions about celebrity and media. In the days following the broadcast, both Sandler and Goldberg were asked about the exchange in interviews and on other platforms. Sandler reiterated that his intent is always to entertain authentically while being aware of audience reception, and Goldberg emphasized that her questions were designed to foster reflection rather than criticism. The conversation was widely recognized as a professional, substantive discussion that modeled how live television can engage with sensitive topics thoughtfully. The segment concluded with the panel thanking Sandler for joining the show and inviting the audience to continue engaging with the ideas discussed. The studio atmosphere was cordial and appreciative, reflecting a mutual respect between guest and hosts. Viewers were left with a clear sense of the complexities involved in balancing humor, social awareness, and artistic expression in today's entertainment landscape. For those watching, this segment offered both insight and perspective. A candid yet professional discussion about the evolving expectations placed on comedians, the impact of intent versus reception, and the thoughtful navigation required in live talk show environments. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.